a conversation between former First Lady Laura Bush and the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero. The conversation will include a discussion of Mrs. Bush's memoir, Spoken from the Heart, her role with the George W. Bush Institute, and her involvement in the planning of the library and the museum. I am very excited about our program tonight, and so therefore I want to be very brief. It is my honor to introduce Anita McBride to you, who will then introduce Mrs. Bush and the archivist. Anita and I have known each other and worked together for years. Her White House service remarkably spans 2 decades and 3 presidential administrations. Anita most recently served as assistant to President George W. Bush and Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush from 2005 to 2009. In this capacity, she advised Mrs. Bush on a full array of domestic and international issues, including education, youth development, women's rights, and health, just to name a few. Anita also served as Director of White House Personnel under President Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush. Since 2010, Anita has been the executive in residence at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies in the School of Public Affairs at American University here in Washington. There, she is responsible for directing program on the legacy of American First Ladies and just planned and held an absolutely fantastic conference at American University on First Ladies this last March, which the Archives Presidential Libraries partnered on. Anita is on many boards and commissions, 2 of which include a member of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council and the President's Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. It is with great pleasure that I would now like to turn the program over to the incredibly competent hands of Anita McBride.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Nancy. One of my greatest memories of working with Nancy was working with her to put together a visit to Camp David at the invitation of Mrs. Bush of all the presidential library directors. It is a great memory after all of the years that we worked together, and I've heard even recently, Nancy, that it's been 3 years, but the gift shop at the Camp David store is still trying to replenish its inventory. Now, I first read about David Ferriero in June of 2010 in the National Journal magazine, just about 6 months after he was sworn in as the 10th Archivist of the United States. I loved reading how this descendant of Irish and Italian immigrants arrived at the archives and immediately began researching his lineage using passenger ship lists. As a fellow first-generation Italian-American, I immediately thought, I like this guy. The article talked about David's service as a Navy hospital corpsman during Vietnam and how he returned to his native Boston and went to work shelving books in the humanities section at one of the nation's major academic libraries, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He worked his way up over 31 years to become the co-director of all the MIT libraries, and then in 1996 was recruited by another top academic institution, Duke University, to become their university librarian. At Duke, he launched a preservation program and raised $50 million to expand and renovate their library. Before coming to the archives, David served as the Andrew W. Mellon Director of Libraries at the New York Public Library, and managed a major technological transformation, helping to integrate their 4 research libraries and 87 branch libraries, thereby creating the largest public library system in the United States and one of the largest research libraries in the world. A self-proclaimed collector-in-chief, David Ferriero is the first archivist of the United States to come from the library field. When I met David at the groundbreaking of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in November 2010, he proposed the idea of this evening's conversation with former First Lady Laura Bush as one librarian to another. David believes Laura Bush's background as librarian-in-chief contributed tremendously to designing the newest and finest library in the presidential library system. I met Laura Bush in Houston, Texas in November 1994. It was the night before the groundbreaking of the George Bush Presidential Library, and hundreds of Bush administration alumni and Bush family had come together for the celebration. It was just about a week after the Texas elections, and as the former personal aide to former President George H.W. Bush, my husband Tim had become close to the Bush family, and he was eager to congratulate George W. Bush as the new governor-elect of Texas and Laura Bush as the soon-to-be Texas First Lady. I remember her warm, welcoming smile and kind words that made me feel like we were the only people in the room. At that moment, I could not have imagined that some years later, I would share part of her walk through history when she became First Lady of the United States. It was a privilege to work alongside Laura Bush and have a bird's eye view of life in the White House with the First Family, visits to big cities and small towns all over our country, and travel to countries all over the world, from Afghanistan to Saudi Arabia to Zambia. Every place Laura Bush went, she connected on a personal level with the people she met and took a genuine interest in all of them. As her chief of staff, I went nearly everywhere with her, and I would observe their reactions, and I understood exactly how they felt. They thought they were the only people in the room, too. In 2001, during the first year of the new Bush administration, I worked in White House personnel and management and administration, sharing my experiences of past White House operations and helping to transition in a new White House staff. But no amount of White House experience could ever prepare you for what happened on September 11th, 2001. Responding to Secret Service commands to get everyone out of the building, I and others helped to evacuate the White House staff. And I led about 70 of them to a downtown office building where speechwriters began drafting the president's evening address to the nation, and where we spent the day accounting for fellow staff members and monitoring the tragic events playing out in D.C., New York, and Pennsylvania. Coming back to the White House the next day, everything changed. The staff was anxious but understanding of rapidly changing procedures for everything. But the calm and steady voice of Laura Bush was already emerging as a source of comfort to our country, especially to parents and children. She paid special attention to her young East Wing staff who had come to work one morning only to be told to take off their shoes and run. I remember hearing that the First Lady asked Reverend Kathy Card, wife of Chief of Staff Andy Card, to come to the East Wing and pray with her staff and offer them words of comfort. At that moment, so many of us in the White House wished that we too worked in the First Lady's office. 4 years later, when she asked me to join her team as Chief of Staff for the second term, I thought about 9/11, and I thought about that evening in 1994 in Houston, Texas, when I met Laura Bush for the first time. Laura Bush was grateful to have the privilege to represent the people of the United States, and I was thrilled to accept her offer and to lead a team that would help her accomplish all the things she wanted to do. Those of us, and some are here tonight, that had the opportunity to work for President and Mrs. Bush know what a privilege it was for us too. At a luncheon we attended today, one of the guests said to me, "Laura Bush is a national treasure." I couldn't agree more. I will always be grateful to Laura Bush for giving me the greatest professional opportunity of my career and the chance to share her journey in American history. But most of all, I am very happy to call her my friend. Please welcome former First Lady Laura Bush and David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States.
Okay.
Welcome all. A special welcome to Representative Doug Lamborn from Colorado and his wife Jeannie, the members of the Foundation for the National Archives Board, and all the other special guests that we have with us tonight. But a very special welcome, Laura Bush, to my house.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate it very much.
As Nancy said, we're going to cover 3 areas. We're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about planning my favorite new presidential library, and then the Women's Initiative of the Bush Institute. So let me start with the book, and I want to read you a quote from the journalist William Zinsser in How to Write a Memoir. He says, "Most people embarking on a memoir are paralyzed by the size of the task. What to put in, what to leave out, where to start, where to stop, how to shape the story. The past looms over them in 1,000 fragments, defying them to impose on it some kind of order. Because of that anxiety, many memoirs linger for years, half-written or never getting written at all." So, was that your experience?
Well, it was in many ways. At first, when I got the book contract, I thought of it as the dreaded book project. And felt like it was a sword over my head. If I wasn't working on it, I felt guilty. It was like homework. But as I got into it, it became easier and easier. Obviously, you can't put in everything, and I knew that from the beginning. I've taped it, I've talked it, instead of trying to type it. I knew if I'd typed it, I'm not a very good typist anyway, but that if I'd typed it, I would constantly edit myself and look for the perfect word. And instead, I taped it and had a transcriber who transcribed the tapes. And so I just started taping stories. Stories from my early life, memories that I had from my early life. And I went back to Midland, where George and I both grew up, and where my mother still lives today, and drove around the streets of Midland. I drove past the houses that my daddy had built, where my mother and dad and I lived when I was little, and then I drove by the 2 houses that George and I lived in together when we were married and had Barbara and Jenna, those first few years that we were married and lived in Midland. And I drove by the church that I'd been baptized in as a baby, and then that George and I married in, and then Barbara and Jenna were baptized in as babies. I drove by the schools I went to. And because both George and I grew up there, he lived in Midland until we were in the 8th grade, and that's when the Bushes moved to Houston, when Mr. Bush took Zapata Oil Company offshore, and so they moved down to the big port city. But because he had lived there till we were in the 8th grade, we had a lot of the same friends. And we stayed friends with them. We're still friends with them. We've been friends with them our whole lives, which has brought Midland to us and made Midland even more of a part of us than just having grown up there and then having lived there for the early part of our marriage and those first few years that we were, after George moved back and then I moved back with him. So Midland really did become a very important part of it. And that's really where I started, with that part of the story. And I wanted people to really understand what it was like to grow up in West Texas in the 50s and 60s like George and I did, what life was like then, and especially out on that desert that Midland is. When we were in elementary school in the early 50s, we had 7 years of drought. And Midland hardly gets any rain anyway. But to grow up in that sort of very, very harsh landscape, but with the biggest, most beautiful sky you've ever seen. There's nothing to obscure it, no native trees, for instance. But what that made and what that means for the character of people that grow up there. People are not pretentious. Pretensions look especially ridiculous in a desert like that. And people are very tough, and they say what they think. They don't debate issues a lot. There's no time for it out there in that kind of weather and landscape. And so I really started with that and talked about Midland and my childhood first when I did those transcripts. And I think that gave a start to the book, the kind of start I really wanted. I wanted it to be very candid. I'm a librarian. I love to read. I love stories. And I know that that's what people like. So I wanted to be able to remember and collect all those stories from those early years of George's and my life.
So you mentioned the sky, so I have to read this little section because I just love it. When you're talking about how you and your mother loved the sky. For almost as far back as I can remember, on a particularly spectacular summer night, mother would gather a blanket and we'd go outside to lie on the ground and gaze up at the sky. The wool of the blanket would scratch at our arms and legs, and we could feel the prick of the hard, sturdy grass blades below. In Midland, the sky sits overhead like a flawless dome, bowing up from the sky, from the earth at the edge of each horizon. The land does not pitch or rise, but remains perfectly flat, without bright lights or tall buildings to obscure our view. So complete was the darkness that all we saw were the stars and the inky blackness.
And that was a wonderful thing that my mother did. And then she also did that with Barbara and Jenna, to go lie on the ground in the summer and look at the stars.
So you were writing at the same time that the president was working on his book. So what was that like? That was actually great to be working on the books together. George is very, very disciplined. I always feel like I'm much more of a procrastinator. And so literally the very first day we were home, January 21st, 2009, he got up and made the coffee, which he always had done. Of course, he didn't have to do that when we lived at the White House, but got up and made the coffee again and brought it to me. And then he went in and sat at his computer and started doing exactly what I did with the transcript, which was just writing down stories, not in any order, just memories as he got to them, stories that he remembered from his years at the White House, when his book is really centered on those years. He has a little bit in the first chapter about growing up and having George and Barbara Bush as parents and what that meant to him and what that meant to his life, and then a little bit about growing up in Midland. But most of his book is centered on his White House years. So he just sat down and started to write anecdotes, stories that he remembered, and then, of course, did what I did with the transcripts, and at one point started to organize them into the book. And was there exchange?
There was exchange. We both had researchers, and our researchers would work together, and if they found something that they thought if my researcher found something she thought George would be interested in, she'd give it to his researcher and vice versa. And then at the end, when I pretty much finished, he read my transcript and he pointed out 3 stories that were in the manuscript, and he said, "Those are my stories." And they were his stories. They were things that happened to him, but that I thought were too good to leave out of my book. And so I made his 3 stories just sort of brief mentions in my book, and then he put them in his book. But the thing about using a researcher, I found all these things that I never had. I talked in the book about losing my little brothers and sisters. My mother had those late miscarriages, and my 2 little brothers and 1 little sister would live. They each lived for a day or 2, and then now with neonatal care like it is, they probably, at least 2 of them probably would have survived, but then they didn't, in Little Western Clinic in Midland, Texas in the late 40s and early 50s. And so my parents, of course, had never gotten their birth certificates. There really wasn't a reason to get their birth certificates. They, weren't living. There wasn't any reason to have them. But my researcher found them. And so I've ordered them just to have for my own archives, the birth certificates of those little brothers and sister that I didn't get to have.
So when you were writing, was your reader in your consciousness? Were you thinking
I think
about...
always. I think the reader is always in your consciousness. What things would they want to hear, and what stories can you tell that would be interesting, that would, in a lot of ways, reveal how I thought and how I was and how George is. I wanted to actually be able to tell the things that a reporter never asks. That we never had the chance to tell about ourselves, or about what it was like to grow up in West Texas, or what, just different things about ourselves that this book gave me the opportunity to tell and to talk about. And also, Anita mentioned September 11th. I really wanted people to remember what it was like. To remember, as time passes, it becomes minimal. It's not quite as important as it was in those days and weeks and months right after. And I wanted people to remember it, to know what it was like, and to remember all the people that we lost, and all the people who are still living with the loss of the person they love best. And so going through each one of those days on my line-by-line calendar, and then the researchers would find out, do different research, but really brought those memories back to me. And I wanted to be able to let people know what it was like to live in the White House then, with the worry that we both had. Of course, we constantly worried about another attack. It was always on our mind. If the phone rang in the middle of the night, you would just have this feeling of worry that you were going to get some kind of bad news. I really sort of quit watching TV. I watched for a while in those first few days after September 11th, and then I stopped for a while, and then one day I thought, well, I'm just going to turn it on, and I was afraid of what I might hear, that I, had had it off for a while, and that something else bad had happened.
You relived many memories, many terrible incidents in the book, and the process of the distance from the event. Personally difficult for you to relive it and then write about it?
That's right. I wrote about the car accident that of course, a lot of people knew about. It was not a secret. Certainly everyone in Midland, all of my friends and everyone knew. And then it came up in the press during George's first presidential campaign. But really, it was not mentioned very much during the 8 years we lived in the White House. I did get a lot of letters during those 8 years, and I still do, from teachers or parents or aunts and uncles of young people who've been in a fatal car wreck and want me to write to them. And I give them the advice that I didn't take, which is to find somebody to talk to about it. A counselor, people in Midland really in 1963 wouldn't have gotten a counselor. That was just something we didn't do, although certainly people would have talked to their ministers or their pastors. And but the way I handled it, and the way I think really everyone did at the time, was just not to talk about it at all. Just not to mention it. And then a lot of ways that's sort of a West Texas way of just not talking about your troubles, and kind of a stiff upper lip, Western style of just not really talking about things that are difficult. And it was difficult to think about it again, and to really, for the first time, because I did think about it and write about it, see it from my eyes now at this age. And I realized when I wrote about it that I was so consumed with it myself that I never thought about it from my parents' viewpoint, and how difficult it must have been for them. The tragedy of it, for them for this to have happened to me, and then also, obviously, the tragedy of what happened to Mike Douglas, my really good friend. And I know now, in this time, that it ruined his family's life, his parents' life. They never got over it. No one that does ever get over it, but they never really were able to deal with it, I think. And, it's terrible. It's a really horrible happening. And it was difficult to write about.
When did you know you were done? Was it hard to stop writing?
When the manuscript was due.
Right. Oh, wait a minute. Tom Wolfe said, used a similar line when they finally grabbed the manuscript of Man in
Exactly.
Full out of his hands.
I had shopped it as a Mother's Day book, which would have been about a year after I started. And then when George got his book contract, which came slightly after mine, his was a fall book. And because his was going to come out in the fall, then mine had to come out in the spring. So I couldn't even, decide to put it off and come out a little bit later than Mother's Day. And that was actually great for me. It was great to have a deadline. You just have to finish and just go ahead and finish it. I went back then at that point. I never had read any of those other biographies by spouses of presidents or other political biographies, but I went back and looked at a lot of them after I got my book contract, and I saw that at the very end, and this is very difficult not to do, when you get a line-by-line schedule, which is what I had for the last 14 years of my life, because I'd had the 6 for the years we were at the governor's mansion, and then the 8 for the years we were at the White House, it's very difficult not to have it start sounding like having to watch somebody else's travel movies. Then I did that, and then I did this, and then I did that, and then I did this. And so I was very determined not to get in such a hurry at the end. And that's what they did. I mean, you can tell they got into a hurry at the end. They needed to turn it in. They had the line-by-line schedule, and it was just very difficult not to write like that. And I did. Mine ended up a little bit like that as well. But I tried to at least be slightly thematic, to talk about Afghanistan, more once instead of all 3 times I went, and not to have it be so travel log-like. But that was the hard part. And then, of course, that you can't put everything in. I mean, you just can't. There are a lot of things later that I thought, I should have written about that. And I have one friend who called me afterwards, and he said, "Laura, you left me out of your book." And he was very hurt. And I know what happened was he got the book and he opened the index and his name wasn't in it. So I said, "Oh, Brad, I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. Really, there wasn't anything I could reveal about you." He was a wild friend, or he is a wild friend. But anyway, so I told George, I said, "George, Brad's feelings are really hurt because I left him out of my book. Is he in yours?" And George said, "Well, now he is." And I'm sure that there are many other really close friends of mine who didn't get mentioned in the book either. And you just can't put everyone in.
Lots of authors have trouble with their publishers about selection of the title. How much control is this your title?
Well, that was my title.
It was your
I had
title.
control, and we actually did it pretty quickly, and it's a lot harder than you think it's going to be to come up with a title. When Jenna and I wrote Read All About It, the children's book we wrote together, we had a really hard time coming up with a title. And of course, Read All About It is really a newspaper phrase. Read all about it. But now, you never hear it anymore as a newspaper phrase. So the whole generation of children that read all about it really don't know that was what a newsboy yelled when he held up the papers to buy. Was spoken from the heart. We came up, they did, and I did, with various ideas, and really just wasn't that hard when we had these ideas to come up with it, because that's really what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be very candid and to be revealing. I mean, I think that is what people like and what people wanted.
So you did a book tour. You went around the country. You met a lot of people. Were there any surprises?
Well, the book tour was a lot more fun than I thought it would be. They're very strenuous, going from book signing to book signing more than 1,000 books at a time, and then getting on a plane and flying to the next city. But it was a lot of fun. A lot of people who worked for me in the administration worked advance for us, volunteer advance in the bookstores, and that was fun. I would run into a lot of people who'd worked for me. I got to see them. A lot of friends came through the line. George Jones, the country music star, had won the Kennedy Center Honors the last year that George and I had the Kennedy Center Honors in 2008, and his wife Nancy Jones lined up with everybody else and came through the line, and that was great to see. Then one funny story, when I was in Pasadena, California, a mother and her little girl came through the line, and you could tell the mother had coached the little girl on who I was, and so she said to her little girl, "Now, who is this?" And the little girl said very confidently, "Carol Burnett." And I saw her book as I left on the shelf, so obviously the mother had brought the little girl to Carol Burnett's signing the week before, and she was very scheduled for it. But it was fun, and one of the really fun parts, of course, are meeting all those bookstore owners everywhere. There are not a lot of independent bookstores left, but I did do several independents, and then, of course, some of the big chain bookstores. But they would all give me a sack of books, of their favorite books, and that was fun to go home with and have the favorite books of those bookstore owners on my bedside table to read next. They're great recommendations.
So let's talk about the library. This is the 13th presidential library under the jurisdiction of the National Archives, or will be when the building is done and turned over. It's a collection of more than 70 million pages, 4 million photographs, 43,000 artifacts, and my favorite, about 240 million email records.
George's presidency is the one that's the first all-email, all 8 years presidency. And this is I'm going to ask you a question now to the archivist. What are you all going to do with all those 200 million emails? I mean, it really does change things for archives.
And we're going to make sure that 100 years from now, people are going to be able to do research in those email messages.
Great.
That's our job.
And probably 2/3 are personal, where someone says, "Will you meet me for lunch?"
But who was that who said that?
Yeah. They all say, all these staff members that are here, that they knew they weren't supposed to have personal messages on the email, but they probably had a few.
So all of this material is actually, as we speak, being processed in a facility outside of Dallas, and under the direction of the wonderful director of the George Bush Library, Alan Lowe.
And Alan Lowe is here.
Where are you, Alan? Stand up and take a bow.
Alan has been terrific and really fun to work with. Thank you, Alan, for coming tonight.
So we broke ground in November. We will cut the ribbon, I hope, in the spring of 2013. We are on schedule.
We're on time, we're on budget, or lower than budget, actually. It's very good.
The best kind, the best kind.
And you might not know, or you probably do know, but the money is raised privately to build the presidential libraries. But on the day of the opening, you hand the keys to the archivist of the United States, and then all the insides of the library, everything in the archives belong to the government of the U.S.
And this archivist is especially anxious to take those keys because this is one gorgeous facility.
It is. It's going to be beautiful.
Two architects. One of my favorite architects, Robert Stern, who did the library at Dartmouth. He did Baker Library at Harvard Business School. The Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge is his. And 15 Central Park West in New York City. A fantastic, fantastic residence that looks like it had been in New York forever. He's one of my favorite architects. And at the same time that Robert Stern was selected, the landscape architect was selected, Michael van Valkenburg, who did the redesign of the Pennsylvania Avenue Plaza in front of the White House, the Harvard Yard restoration, Rockefeller University's new roof garden, the garden at Turtle Creek in Dallas is his also. The selection of building architect and landscape architect at the same time, was that you?
That was me and my really good friend Dee Dee Rose, who lives in Dallas and is very particularly interested in architecture. She's right now the president of the Dallas Museum of Art Board, which she's done for a number of years. But I asked her to serve on the committee with a lot of other people when we did the architectural competition and we interviewed the different architects. And Dee Dee was very insistent from the very first that you also have a landscape architect, that it was just so important as you build the building to know what the landscape is going to be around the building. And so that was great. And I'd worked with Michael on the Pennsylvania Avenue redo, and so that was fun to work with him there. And one of the great things about Bob Stern is that SMU is a Georgian campus, collegiate Georgian campus. Of course, they wanted us to fit in, and we do. But I also wanted this to not look like I wanted it to look like a building that would house the papers from the first decade of the new century. I wanted it to be modern, to look forward really rather than fit in so perfectly. But I did also want it to fit in the campus, and I think Bob Stern has done a really great job on that. He's done a lot of libraries. He's done other things for other museums. Mm-hmm. He's not done a presidential library, but he has a very large and very experienced firm, which was great to work with, because this is, as you can tell, a very large and complicated project. When you're building for the archives, you have all the archives rules. And I knew about that because I'd asked Nancy Smith and the other directors of the presidential libraries to come to Camp David shortly before we left. Nearly all the directors of the presidential libraries did not know the president. They're the next generation after the president whose library they're managing. And none had ever been to Camp David. And of course, Camp David is a really very important part of life in the White House. For some presidents go more often than others, but Franklin Roosevelt was the one who had picked Camp David as a site for a presidential retreat. And of course, he's the one with the first presidential library. So all the presidents who have a presidential library went to Camp David, some at least. And so they all came, the directors, and I had an ulterior motive, really. I wanted to ask them things. I wanted them really to tell me things that I needed to know as we started this process. By this time, we had started the design meetings and working with Robert Stern, and every one of the directors said, work with NARA. Work with them to start with, so that you don't make the mistake of having to go back and retrofit or put different film on the windows because you've got too much light for papers. And of course, because I'm a librarian, I knew a lot of those things, but really it was very helpful to meet with them and to know that from the very beginning, NARA would be our partner and that we would need to work and follow their rules, and that it really would save us a lot of time and trouble if we just did that from the very beginning.
So let's look at some slides and you can walk us through.
Okay.
The first, one of the things that I'm really very pleased about is Stern's ability to integrate this into the campus architecture. And this is the SMU campus in Dallas, Laura Bush's alma mater.
That's Dallas Hall, which was the original building at SMU, and I had classes in Dallas Hall when I was there. I wasn't there actually when the building was built.
And there is the library.
That's the back side of the library. You can see those balconies that have a view of downtown Dallas, of the skyline of downtown Dallas, and we have an agreement with SMU that they can't ever build anything on that that would block that view of downtown Dallas. This is on the south side, which of course would be the sunniest side in Texas, and so those terraces have overhangs which will keep them cooler, we hope, on that side. That is actually the Institute side that you're looking at. That will be where the fellows who are part of the Bush Institute will have their offices. And then on the top floor, that top balcony, is our residence. You might not know that many of the presidential libraries have a real residence, a real apartment for the president. And the Bushes have one, for instance, at a College Station, because they live in Houston, but they love to go over on the weekends and spend the weekend at College Station and be with all those Aggies and be able to bring, convene, bring leaders and bring speakers and bring all sorts of terrific programs to Texas A&M. But because George and I live in Dallas, we didn't do ours with bedrooms. It's just going to be a very lovely, entertaining space for us. It's a big living room and a library, and then a large dining room where we can host gatherings. If we're having a series of speakers, we can have a dinner for the speaker upstairs in this residence. And then our own offices are off to the side of this residential space where that'll be our offices there in the Institute and part of the library. One thing that you can see from this balcony, those balconies in the last picture, is the native prairie that we're building. That's all native prairie that we have on that side of the library. This is the front of the library, and you can see the Freedom Tower that Bob Stern put there at the very top of it. It sort of is a reminder of the dome on Dallas Hall, but this is really more a tower, and it'll be lighted so that at night you'll see this lovely glow of light from the Freedom Tower that is over the grand hall of the library. And when you walk into the library, you walk through this grand hall under the skylight of the Freedom Tower, and then to one side of you will be the big dark box that the museum will be in, the museum part, and then obviously the archives will be in rooms that are where there's not light like this, not skylights, where things can be conserved. And then to the right side of this grand hall is a temporary space where we can have traveling shows from, great shows that come from museums around the country, and particularly, I think, shows of American history. I think there's not another venue like this in Dallas for shows from the different history museums, and I think that'll be a lot of fun. I'm on the board of the new Smithsonian African American Museum that's in the design stage right now, and so I think it'll be terrific to have some of their temporary shows there at SMU.
And shows from the National Archives.
That's right, absolutely, absolutely. That is the walkway up, and we've worked the whole time with Michael Van Valkenburg on trees. In fact, we just transplanted from another part of SMU, not our property where we are, but where they're getting ready to build some dorms, a 50-foot tall live oak that our arborists say we'll be able to keep alive that we've transplanted. We've transplanted a lot of trees from where SMU's getting ready to build a dorm. The idea will be that you'll drive off Central Expressway, which is the big side of the SMU campus, into Michael Van Valkenburg's idea, sort of a forest where a lot of trees will drive in on what's called SMU Boulevard. And then you'll drive past the library on SMU Boulevard. But Michael Van Valkenburg wanted there to be this sort of green space where you drove off the freeway and drove into this forest on either side of the road, just to have this sort of space and this sigh, really, of relief of getting off Central and driving into this space before you pass the library. These trees will also hide the parking lot that'll be on one side of the street going by the library, and it'll hide it both from the street so that you just won't see those cars, and then from the neighborhood that's on the other side of it. Bob Stern always draws himself in every
There he is.
picture,
right.
and you see him. Yeah, can you see Bob Stern? He's in this picture right here. He always puts himself in all of his renderings. So that's going in, and you'll see those limestone columns. The building will be LEED Platinum, which is the highest LEED designation. We're using limestone. It's called Permian stone, and it's from the Permian Basin, very close to Midland, Texas. It's really pretty. It's a lovely cream color. And then the red brick, the Georgian brick that SMU likes to have, that is also close from a brick mill that's close enough to have the LEED Platinum designation. But that's the big sort of enveloping, I think, opening that will sort of open its arms to the people who come into the library. One of the things we're doing is water retention. This is one of the extra ways we can get to LEED Platinum. One of NARA's rules is to make sure the building will never flood. You know, to make sure that the drainage, everything that you've done around the building will make sure that there won't ever be water inside the building. And so we were careful about that with the way the building is sited and lifted up a little bit above the street level. And then in the back of the building, the part we were looking at when we were looking at the balcony side, where the native meadow, wildflower and native prairie meadows will be, we've dug very deep cisterns, and there will be a lot of water. Where the water runs off will be water retention, and we'll be able to irrigate all this native prairie from those cisterns that are back there. This is the Texas Rose Garden. We're building a full-scale replica of the Oval Office. Many presidential libraries have a replica of the Oval Office. And President Bush, George's dad, when he built his, decided not to put a replica of the Oval Office. He knew President Reagan had one in his and others had one in theirs, and so he just thought he wouldn't do it. But in fact, that's the only time many people ever have a chance to go in anything that's like an Oval Office. So when they just redid part of their presidential library, they did add a replica of the Oval Office. So all along we knew we would have one, but we're going to have also the Oval Office will be set up at the same aspect of the real Oval Office with the south windows that the real Oval Office has, and then the doors that go out to a rose garden. And so our rose garden will be within the secure space of the museum. So when you come into the museum and you get what they call museum fatigue from having walked through the dark spaces that museums usually are, you can walk through the Oval Office, you can sit at the president's desk, you can have your picture made at the president's desk, and then you can walk out for some fresh air to the rose garden. And of course it won't be an absolute replica because it's in Texas. So it'll be a Texas rose garden with roses that will do well there, and other plantings that will do well there in the Texas heat. It'll also be a space of contemplation because you will, in our museum design, which is still preliminary, we just had a big design meeting this week and we're getting pretty far along, but we're not totally. You will walk through a space around September 11th. And we have one of those big 23 feet tall steel, bent steel pieces from Ground Zero that'll be in the middle of this September 11th space. And you'll walk through the minutes between everything that happened on the day of September 11th and then the days after with the National Cathedral prayer service that Friday morning, and then George going to Ground Zero with the bullhorn, which of course is one of the artifacts that'll be in the library, and then the memorial service that I went to the next week in the field of Flight 93, in the field outside of Shanksville. And so it'll really be the only museum in the world. I mean, I think obviously there'll be the museums at Ground Zero and the memorial at Shanksville and the beautiful memorial that's already complete here at the Pentagon. But this will be the only presidential library, really, that will have what it was like to live in the White House and to get the messages as the day went on about what happened on September 11th. And so after you've been through that, I think it'll be dramatic. We will have a wall of names as well. And then I think people may want to be able to, at that point, to go outside a little bit and be able to contemplate what they just walked through. This is more of the rose garden, I think, or this is the outside. The SMU gave us about 25 acres of property, and we're using about 14 acres up not way down on Mockingbird Lane. The property actually goes to a point like this. So this will be the native plants. There will be a wetland, and all of the way Michael Van Valkenburg is designing it is to collect the water runoff. The water will run when it rains through this sort of wetland area and then into the cisterns where it's collected for irrigation. And we'll use native prairie. George and I have restored now almost 100 acres of native prairie on our property at the ranch. We've been working on it for 10 years. It's very difficult to restore native prairie. It takes a long time. We plowed and then used a judicious amount of Roundup to get rid of the non-native, very invasive grasses that people sowed, of course, because they were feed grasses. And it's taken us a long time. We started off on 40 acres and we plowed for 4 years, and then we thought that would be enough, but in the 4th year we were in a drought. And we couldn't get the seed from an intact prairie that we had access to. But in the 5th year, we had one of those years that we can get every once in a while where we got 56 inches of rain at the ranch. Wow. And we had that great seed, and so our big native prairie is now really established. And so it can withstand the drought that we have right now. But you might be interested to know that we're working with another presidential family. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center is our partner on this. Michael Van Valkenburg is from Boston, and even though he's done native plantings, he did it at Wellesley, at their beautiful site, did native wildflowers like this on a site that had been sort of a dump on the edge of their property, and then they wanted to incorporate this property because they needed to build more buildings at the college. But he is from Boston, so he immediately went to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and they've been our partners. We have a test project at a big nursery in Dallas where we're growing a variety, mixture of Texas native grasses for our turf grass to be able to, that'll withstand a lot of traffic, and that won't be needed to be mowed or watered a lot, and that has been very successful, and that's a partnership we've had with them. And I just went to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center Gala in Austin. The Wildflower Center was open when George was governor, and we had hosted on the governor's mansion lawn the luncheon for the opening of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And of course, we really got to know Lady Bird Johnson during those years that we were in Austin. Of course, she was there as well. And then that night, we went to the opening gala of the Wildflower Center. And then, just as this is an aside, and I put it in my book, but I got to host Lady Bird Johnson. Linda brought her one time to the White House, and she'd had a stroke, so she'd lost her speech. And Linda, she was in a wheelchair, and Linda pushed her around, but she was still so expressive. When she saw the portrait of her husband, Lyndon Johnson, she sort of put her arms out to him, and then when she saw something else, she remembered, she put her hands together and sort of gasped. And it was really a great privilege for me to be able to have Lady Bird Johnson come to the White House and to be able to show her around. And our doorman at the time had been Mater D when the Johnsons lived there at the White House, and then he had retired, and then he had come back from retirement to be a doorman. And when Lady Bird Johnson saw, he met her at the door, obviously, and I did too, and walked out to the South Lawn to meet her, and Mr. Wilson just fell into her arms. It was really sweet to see.
So I'm particularly excited about cutting the ribbon on this facility because of the wonderful attention, and you can hear the passion here in terms of the landscape, but also the materials that are being used and the adherence to the NARA standards. Thank you very much. So let's move on to the Women's Initiative. So the Bush Center Institute has several themes: education reform, global health, human freedom, and economic prosperity, and an overarching theme devoted to the Women's Initiative, and you've played a key role in that. The goals of the Women's Initiative to promote women's rights in the Middle East, along with developing programs to encourage girls and women here at home to transform their communities into better places. So talk about where that came from and what you've accomplished so far, because you've accomplished an amazing amount.
Well, as George says, we're out of politics, but we're still interested in policy. And so that's what the Bush Institute is going to give us the chance to continue to work in the four policy areas that were the most important to us: education reform, global health, economic opportunity, and human freedom. And so even though, and that's what the Institute will work on, and I can see from the note that we're almost out of time, so I'll be really quick. So,
No.
because we didn't get to any of the audience questions. I talked too long. Oh, you've got them there. But anyway, so going across all four of these policy areas is the Women's Initiative that I'm chairing. We've hosted already two conferences with Afghan women and on Afghan women, one focusing on literacy and education for women and girls in Afghanistan, and the most recent one on the economic empowerment of women. As we watch right now the drawdown of troops in Afghanistan and the so-called reconciliation talks with the Taliban, I know many, many Americans, especially American women, are nervous. We don't want to see Afghan women lose their very fragile rights. And President Karzai video conferenced in March 30th to our conference in Dallas about economic empowerment of women, and he reassured us that in these talks that one of the stipulations is that they will agree to support the Constitution, which does guarantee the rights of women. And so that's what we're hoping, because when you look around the world and you see the countries where half of the population is marginalized, where half of the population can't contribute either to the economy or to civic life, then you see countries that are failing. And certainly Afghanistan was failing. And we just hope that it doesn't go back to that, and that they will really be able to continue to build their democracy and continue to protect the rights of women, and that women will have the chance to succeed there. So that's one of the conferences, one of the Women's Initiative conferences we've done, but we have many more planned. We're looking at Egypt now, looking at women there and what we can do at the Institute, but really across the United States, what American women can do to help Egyptian women there now as they start to do what we all hope, which is to build a democracy.
And how can people keep up with what you're doing and help?
Well, they can look at the website, and there's a website for the George Bush Presidential Library already, and Institute, and so I hope you all will do that.
And you can sign up and become a member.
That's right, yeah, become a member. You can still become a charter member. Thank you, David, for giving me that entree to say that.
Okay, so some questions for you. Has your time out of Washington changed your perception of the years you were here?
That's interesting. I mean, not really. I don't think so. You know, when you live in the White House, you are so constantly bombarded with events, and you're so busy that every event runs into each other. And it's sort of one of the nice things about being out and writing the book was having the chance to have that sort of reflection that you don't have a chance to have when you live there, because you're just getting in bed at night thinking about what you're going to do the next day, not what you did that day, but you know what's on the agenda. In fact, that's when I really realized that I had been sort of under stress when I lived at the White House. When I would get in bed in those first few weeks that we were home, and I'd start thinking, now what do I have to do tomorrow? And then I'd realize, I don't have anything to do tomorrow. And it was a great relief to not have to start thinking about what my speech was going to be or what my event was going to be.
Can you tell us what your husband has been doing since leaving the White House and what his projects are for the future?
He's been working also a lot on the Institute. Of course, he's been fundraising for the Bush Library, but we've had several conferences on the economy, a 4% growth conference with 4 Nobel Prize economists. We had a conference on natural gas nation, because we have so much natural gas in the United States now, in all parts of the United States, not just Texas. And, we could really be energy independent if we were able to drill for that natural gas, and it's clean burning. And hopefully that would sort of get us over the technological time that it's taking us to figure out even cleaner ways to produce energy in the United States. He's very interested in the human freedom part of the Institute. We just hosted a couple of weeks ago a human freedom conference. We had Tunisians and Egyptians come. Ibrahim Said from Egypt video conferenced in. We had dissidents and freedom fighters from other parts of the world, from Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and Syria come as well to talk. The Egyptians and the Tunisians talked to us, told us what it was like, and then we talked to them about what's next. Because these were really movements of the people. They were mass protests. They're almost leaderless. So they don't have the advantage of a Václav Havel or a Lech Walesa, who is sort of a leader as they lead to a democracy, and that's worrisome because they don't know what to do next. And I'm hoping that all those new Central and Eastern European democracies will have the chance to be able to go to Egypt and Tunisia and try to coach them and help them build a democracy, because it's hard. And it's especially hard when you don't have, a few really strong leaders there that had been the freedom fighters for years, like Václav Havel had been, and Lech Walesa had been in Poland.
As a librarian, what would you recommend to someone now entering the field to do to prepare for the technology changes and budget cutting that libraries are experiencing?
Well, that is a very, very difficult question. And one thing I would say to everyone is continue to advocate for your libraries. Let your city council members or whoever's cutting your budgets know that it's very, very important. The other thing friends of library groups can do is just to try to raise money privately as well, or find other philanthropists who can step in during tough times like these economic times are. I met with a really great group of library PhD students in Seattle when I was out there recently for a speech. They're all 21st century, they've won 21st century librarian grants. Laura Bush 21st century librarian grants that were part of IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and it was really an effort to try to broaden the field of librarians. It was sort of something that older people did, I guess, and young people hadn't thought of. But in fact, now many library schools are iSchools. They really are about information, and I hope that it'll be more attractive to young people to realize that it's not the old library where the librarian says, shh, but in fact it's really, and David knows this from what he did for New York Public, but really it's very important that people who are very technologically savvy now to work in libraries and to manage that huge amount of information we now have because of the internet.
I would just reinforce what Laura Bush said about advocacy. At a time when the economy is as it is, lots of folks don't have the luxury of buying their own books.
It's even more important, yeah.
Being out of work and looking for jobs, all the applications are online now. You have to be facile online. When I was at the New York Public Library, 50% of our population, 50%, had no internet connectivity at home. They depended upon the public library for that. So libraries
and during
today,
tough times, a lot of people, the library use actually goes up because people do just what David said. They come in and use the computers there, and they probably need the help of a librarian to navigate it. They're probably not that computer savvy if they don't have one at home and need that kind of help. So I think that's really important. I didn't mention in the education reform part, we have three really, when you're talking about a poor economy and cuts, because we're seeing that across the United States in school districts and even universities, three great programs there. One's a developing leaders in education principals. I noticed last September during Education Nation and Education Week, you saw a lot of teacher bashing, which I don't really appreciate. And in fact, if principals are really good, they're the ones who structure the school, and teachers are much more likely to be successful if they have an excellent leader in their school and excellent principal. So we're working at the Institute with the School of Education at SMU, and then with a number of other schools of education around the country and school districts around the country to be able to try to reach the 130,000 principals. There are several million teachers, but there are only 130,000 principals in the United States, and I think we can reach them with certification and with training and try to recruit leaders for schools who can really structure successful schools. So that's one of the programs we're doing. Another one I'll mention quickly is Middle School Matters. It's to try to really reach kids at the last chance they have if they're not up to grade level before they go to high school, and I'm really excited about that. But the third one, the reason I thought of this, is a big study on how school money is spent, how school districts spend their money, and what are the ways they can maximize their amount of money for student achievement. What part of what they spend really translates to student achievement. And so a lot of education researchers are working on this, and hopefully we'll be able to advise school districts on the way they can handle their money the best way so that their student achievement's not harmed in times of economic downturns.
Could you please talk a bit about your experience in Haiti?
Yeah, I did go to Haiti. I have not been since the earthquake, but of course George has, because George and Bill Clinton had the Bush-Clinton fund, and they've been a couple of times. Ann McDonald, who works for me, who's my director of my office now, is right over here, and she spent the first year after the administration in Haiti. And she was in Haiti, staying at the Hotel Montana. That's where she lived. Fortunately, she wasn't there because that's where a lot of Americans died. She was at her French class. She was being a really good girl and going to school. But so it's been very helpful for George to have Ann in our office now, as both he and Bill Clinton have worked on the Clinton Bush Fund for Haiti. And I think it's about finished. I think the idea always behind it would be seed money that would try to start things and be able to step in right at the first to be able to help people. And so we get good reports out of Haiti, not great, but they do have a new president. And I think the people in Haiti have some confidence that that the good president is going to be a good president, and that maybe things really will start to look up for them. And so that's what we all hope. But it was a huge, huge disaster. And Japan has now had that same kind of disaster. I just saw the New Zealand ambassador today at a lunch, and New Zealand also had that very bad earthquake right in their main city where they didn't expect it, and they've had 7,000 aftershocks, which they said is very psychologically difficult for the people of New Zealand to live with those. Is this the big one? I'm sure they're thinking again the next time. He also said that many Americans had been helpful, and that it was just such characteristic of Americans to be philanthropic and to step in immediately and help, and he was very appreciative of that.
From knowing your husband and being around politicians, what is the greatest piece of advice you could give a young person aspiring to enter politics?
It ain't as bad as it looks. I know what George would say. If you are interested in politics, he would say, go to work. Figure out what party you want to be in, who is representing the views that you have, and go to work for campaigns. It's a really great experience. And of course, he did that. He had the chance to do it with his dad's own campaigns. George was 18 when his dad ran for Senate in Texas, and he traveled a lot with him and was very fascinated by it. And then when he finished college, he worked for a candidate in Alabama, and he worked for a candidate in Florida, and really did learn a lot about just what you need for campaigns, what the numbers mean for campaigns. How can you win? Can you get enough votes out of this part of your district that would be normally your voters to overcome the votes that your opponent's going to get from another part there? It really is sort of a numbers business, and the actual campaigns are. And he would say, go to work, lick envelopes for your candidates and hang around their campaign headquarters and really learn about it that way. That's a very good way to start. And then get in the race. There are plenty of would-be governors that never bothered to run. And so, it's just take the risk and try it. And politics is a people business. If you like people, it's a really great business to be in, because you meet millions of people, and that's really the privilege of serving in the White House, is I got to meet people all over our country. And of course, I got to meet the Dalai Lama and the Queen of England and the Pope and all those people as well. But the people that really meant the most to me were the ones that didn't have any titles, that just went to work every day and worked hard and were great citizens of our country.
And on that note, thank you for gracing our stage tonight.
Thank you, David. Thank you for working with us at the library. It's been great.
Pleasure.
And thank you, everybody, for coming. And hello to all my good friends that are out there. I know there's some people that worked on my staff and George's staff that are here. Andy Card is here, who was George's chief of staff for 6 years almost. So there's Andy over there. I see Andy over there. So thanks, everybody.